Hi, I'm Paolo Viscardi. I'm a zoology curator at the National Museum of Ireland, Natural History, which is better known as the Dead Zoo. And I'm here today, I'm going to be talking about animals and plants that you find in Ireland and how that has changed over time. So looking at the past and maybe bringing that through to get some ideas for the future. And I'll be using some of the objects here in the museum to explain how we have evidence for the different species that used to be here that aren't here today. When we think of Ireland, we think of it as being an island off the coast of Europe. But Ireland's actually got quite a complex geological past, and when you go further and further back in time, you see that what we think of as Ireland today has changed a huge amount over a very long period of time. So at one point, Ireland was actually on two different continents, which have kind of crashed together. And in that crash, it's created the different geologies that we see up in the north and down in the south of Ireland. So humans didn't just turn up and stay. It wasn't that simple. As the climate changed, the vegetation and the animals also changed, including humans, because humans were using those resources. They were using the plants, they were using the animals. And to start with, humans were probably just using the coastline and using things like shellfish and fish, and not really going into the mainland of Ireland. And then over time, as the climate improved and the types of animals and plants which grew in Ireland became more suitable for humans to utilise, they would have started moving in and getting established. And then, of course, you get things like farming, which is when humans really took control of their environment much more and started to make changes to make it easier to live. And so we don't really see that in Ireland until a few thousand years ago. Before that, what we have is this incredible changing environment where you go from almost like Arctic tundra and kind of glaciers where you have very little alive, right the way through to these quite mature oak forests which would have covered a large portion of the island. You can't really talk about any one of those environments as being kind of what Ireland used to be like, because all of those are environments that Ireland used to be like. At some points we had a climate which was much more suitable for animals that you might associate more with the Mediterranean or even tropical areas. So, for example, we have fossils from caves of things like this. This is a hyena jaw. And it's the same species of hyena that you get in Africa today, the spotted hyena. And we know what it is because we can look at these teeth and get a really, you can compare them to the existing species of hyenas, and you can get a really clear link between the two. And these days we also have genetic testing, so you can still extract DNA from bones this old, although it's getting easier, but it's not easy. So there's a huge amount of information locked up in fossil remains, mostly from caves. So what we know about Ireland before glaciations tends to come from cave deposits, because during glaciations, when these big kind of chunks of ice are moving down from the north and just scouring the landscape, everything just gets scoured away. So you're left with kind of an empty kind of clean sheet, which when the ice retreats and you get a new environment forming, that's when the things from that get laid down. So things like the giant Irish deer, you find them in caves going back 20,000 years, but you tend not to find them in younger deposits until about 10,000 years ago, which is when the kind of last giant deer were in Ireland. They kind of left about maybe 10, 11,000 years ago, and that seems to coincide around the time that humans were first starting to arrive and get settled and established, rather than just showing up to kind of utilise some of the environment before going off again. We also know that we've had colder spells where you have things like tundra, and so we have things like this is a bit of reindeer, and you don't tend to think of reindeer as being here in Ireland, but actually this is another cave fossil which shows that they were definitely here, and during the colder spells it would have been a great environment for reindeer, very similar to what you get in kind of Lapland today. And we also find things like these. This is actually a bear's jaw from a cave. And it's quite interesting because DNA work has been done on some of these remains from caves with the bears. And it's a type of brown bear. But this particular population of brown bears, it seems, are the closest relative to things like polar bears, which we still have up in the Arctic. So it seems that Ireland actually played quite an important role in kind of influencing the fauna that we see today all over Europe, not just on this little island. But on the island itself, we do find endemic what we'd call endemic species. So those are things which actually kind of arose on the island. Now, there are very few true endemic species in Ireland, and there is a species of kind of little worm, which was found actually quite recently, a few years ago, which comes from the peat bogs, and they've not been found anywhere else. And the first example of that species was discovered in a bog in Ireland, and it's here in the museum, and it's called a type specimen because it's the first one that was found, and that is the type that all the others that anyone else finds relates back to. So those are the sorts of things which you tend to find as kind of unique endemic species, whole species that arose just on Ireland. But then you have things which are from populations which have managed to stay in Ireland all the way through quite a long period of time and surviving some of those glaciations and probably clinging on right down the southern edges of the country. So things like the Irish stoat, the Irish dipper, there are coal tits, which are unique to Ireland, and jays as well. All of those are animals which have Irish forms, which are genetically quite different to the ones that you find in Britain, for example. We also know that Ireland has changed the animals coming in and out because of its changing environment. So, for example, woodpeckers, we don't think of them as being an Irish species. We tend to think of them as being absent from Ireland, although they are now beginning to come back. But in the past, they almost certainly would have been here when there was a great level of forest cover. One animal which never really seems to have been found in Ireland, and there have never been any fossils found, would be snakes. So grass snakes and adders, for example, are found in the UK. And they just aren't found in any remains in Ireland so far. So it suggests that things like the St Patrick's kind of story, actually, it probably didn't drive the snakes out of Ireland. I don't think they were here to start with, and we have no evidence to say that they were. But what we do find is that sometimes snakes do come over, and grass snakes can swim very well, even over a sea as big as the Irish Sea. And it's not usual for them to be turning up, but every so often they do turn up, and they also get released by people. And people are actually quite a big, important part of how Ireland has changed in the more recent centuries. So humans turning up in Ireland and actually starting to farm is what really changed the landscape into something that we recognise today. The first thing that would have happened would be things like hillsides being kind of deforested so that the thinner soils there could be worked with the kind of more basic tools that were available at the time and people knew about, because the heavy soils that you get in valleys would have just been too heavy for the kind of equipment that they had. As technology improved, and farming technology, and especially ploughing technology improved, it meant that agriculture was able to spread down into the more fertile valleys, and that's really where we start seeing deforestation starting on a big scale. And that would have carried on for a very long time, but that would have been hundreds and possibly thousands of years before we get to the point where we have an island that we'd probably recognise today, although it would have been much more heavily forested than it is now. And then there were big periods of deforestation, and more recently, especially where things like oak trees would have been felled for use in naval building, and also because people need farmland, and as populations increase and grow, it means that there's greater pressure on reclaiming land from the wild to make it into land for growing produce. And so that's led us to kind of where we are today. And as a result of that, we've lost a lot of the species that used to be in Ireland. Things like the wild boar, wolves. We know that wolves were present in Ireland until around the kind of middle of the 18th century. And we have wolf remains from caves. They've been here for a long time, but then they were kind of wiped out by people. And that's not an uncommon story. It's the same in the UK, and when you go into mainland Europe, it's the same for lots of places in Europe, although that seems to be reversing a little bit now as people become a little bit more conscious and aware of the environment, and kind of there's a bit of a move away from just the persecution of carnivores. And carnivores were always seen as a bit of a problem because they would take things like livestock, and that would scare people. You don't want to lose your livelihood. And you'd also find issues with kind of gamekeepers in particular. So the kind of use of land for, say, rearing pheasants or grouse or those sorts of game birds would be, that's quite heavily managed land. So there's a lot of work involved in managing those sorts of estates for people to go shooting or to go hunting in different ways. And that generally would have meant persecution of other predatory animals. So eagles in particular were affected by gamekeepers in the kind of early 19th century. And we found that species of eagle, the biggest species of eagle in Ireland, the white-tailed eagle, was wiped out towards the end of the 19th century. Now those have been reintroduced through breeding programs, which is a fantastic thing to see because they're these amazing animals. But of course, it's not the same population that was in Ireland originally. And so this is one of those issues that we have when we talk about repopulating a particular species or rewilding. You can't have that same population that was in a space beforehand because the genes have been lost. That information, that genetic information has gone forever. And part of that genetic information from a particular place will have been giving an advantage to the animals that lived there because those adaptations, those little tweaks in the DNA are the things which would have made it better for that animal to live in that particular place, make them more suited to that environment. So it's always a shame when we lose that genetic information and that diversity. And one thing we also know is not only is there loss, there's also gain. So new animals are coming into Ireland all the time. So we tend to think of those which have been introduced. So there are a lot of animals which aren't native to Ireland and have never really been here kind of historically or even prehistorically. Some species have been introduced to Ireland from new, which have never been here before. So humans will bring things like fish stocks over to populate freshwater lakes and ponds for angling. They'll also bring in some game birds, things like pheasants, which you see very commonly, but they're originally from kind of India. They're not a native Irish species at all, even though you'll see them quite commonly. There are also species which have been introduced not deliberately, but by accident. So you have things which are brought in by say the pet trade or the aquarium trade, and certainly things like the freshwater crayfish from America, things like the signal crayfish. People release them without really thinking about the consequences, and so you end up with things like viruses and various different diseases being spread through the native crayfish populations, brought in by crayfish from other places where they've evolved a defence against those sorts of illnesses and those diseases that the local population just hasn't been exposed to, so they're much more susceptible to it. There are also things which are moving across quite naturally. So when we think about things like the false widow spider, a lot of people talk about them as this kind of terrifying invasion. Actually, it's a fairly normal sort of thing to happen, is to have invertebrates, these small things which have quite rapid population times, and they can travel around on things very easily. They are from Europe, they are from a more southerly part of the world, but as the climate is changing, as climate change makes things warmer, it means that they're able to move further north. And so where in the past you might have species like turning up on a goods shipment coming from Spain, for example, and being left in Ireland, they wouldn't necessarily have survived very well. And trade has been happening forever. As soon as kind of human populations have become established, there's been trading between different nations. So it's nothing new. This is something which has always happened. The speed at which it happens is much faster these days with things like planes and with rapid sea travel. And it means that you've got a better chance of something surviving on its way in. But once it arrives, unless you've got a climate which it's able to live in, it's not going to get established. But with climate change, the climate has made it much more reasonable for things coming from further south to survive. And again, this can pose some issues for the native wildlife, but again, it's not necessarily always bad. So we tend to think of what we call invasive species, introduced species, as being invasive species, but that's not always the case, and they don't always have kind of conflict with the native populations, because often they will have a very different lifestyle, and sometimes they can actually provide a resource for native populations. It's where you have those populations which are actually encroaching on a native species and how it lives, and especially when it brings disease with it. So things like grey squirrels bring disease which red squirrels just aren't able to cope with very well. So it means that it's not only physically the grey squirrel, which is bigger and kind of more aggressive, taking over those habitats of red squirrels, it's also bringing disease with it as it does it. But then we find interesting stories like the pine marten. The populations have declined very, very dramatically, and they're starting to recover now, partly because of the introduction of the grey squirrel, because the grey squirrel is basically easier for the pine martens to catch. And it's a good food source for them, and it's very widespread. And so it means that they're actually improving the population of the pine marten. And funnily enough, it's actually improving the population of the red squirrel, which is now not getting as much competition from the grey squirrels, because the pine martens are maintaining the population at a lower level. And also because now the grey squirrels are a preferred food from the pine marten. For the amount of effort to go and get a little red squirrel, you can put in the same amount of effort to get a bigger grey squirrel. Has a lot more food in it. You'd be silly not to go for the grey. So introduced species aren't always a terrible thing, but they're a mixed bag, and you can't really tell how they're going to impact on the native population of animals and plants, actually, until they actually get established, by which point it's usually a bit too late to know. So that's one of the reasons why we do tend to be quite cautious about introduced species, and we tend to think of them as being a negative thing. What we do find is that we get species which kind of pop over and visit. So you have migrants which come from, say, further north. They come down here to overwinter, and then they head further back up north, up towards the Arctic Circle. And you have other species which come to spend the summer here and breed, and then they head back down south for the winter, things like swallows. So you have this kind of to and fro, and this exchange of different species, especially of birds, because they're very, very mobile. They can move over large distances because of their ability to fly. But sometimes you actually get them coming from even further afield, and not deliberately. So we're finding at the moment, as we're getting more and more big storms coming up from the Atlantic, a lot of birds are getting caught up in these strong winds and these kind of tail ends of hurricanes, and are actually being blown off course or being moved over the ocean and landing in Ireland, because we're right in the extreme western edge of Europe, and as a result it's the first landfall for a lot of these birds coming over from America. In the last few years, we've had species which have never been recorded in Ireland before turning up from America, things like the least bitten, which is a tiny bird. It's amazing that it managed to survive the journey over to Ireland, although unfortunately, as with most of these birds which come such a long distance, it was in terrible condition when it arrived, and sadly it died afterwards. Some of the birds which have come across are actually able to cope with it, and they've become little landmark animals which people go and see, especially birds. Ornithologists love going and finding unusual species which have turned up in the country. And so long as they can get established and actually recover from their journey across, there's nothing to stop them from living. But of course, it's usually one or two animals, and they can't really establish a breeding population. So although they're kind of visitors, they're not really going to get established. So the future of Ireland in terms of the animals and plants that are here is basically going to be largely dependent on things like climate change, and as it gets warmer it means that species from further south will move into Ireland because it becomes a more suitable environment for them. But it's also going to be based around what humans do. We have a huge responsibility for what goes on in the world around us now. We change our environment to suit ourselves. And so when we talk about things like forest cover, we can make active decisions about whether we want more trees, and also what kind of trees we might want to be planting. And if we want to do that in a way which is sustainable and actually kind of has greater benefit for more species than just us, then we need to think about planting things like broadleaf trees which are native to Ireland and which the species which are present here already, they've adapted to utilise. We can also think about how our farming methods work, and whether we want to be using high-intensity farming, whether we want to be using organic methods, whether we want to be using GM. All of these sorts of things, they all have different reasons for being developed. They all have different reasons for being used. And what we need to do as a kind of population living in this country is to think about how all of those things fit together and where we want to find ourselves in the next 100 years. Because the decisions we make now will have a huge impact on our future. So right now we're in the middle of some building work here in the museum. We're getting a new roof, and while you can't come into the building at the moment, we do still have online resources that you can access to engage with the collections and find out what we've been getting up to. So if you go to the National Museum of Ireland website, there's a huge range of resources available for you there. And we have a lot of social media channels, both through the main museum site, and the Dead Zoo has its own Twitter account, which is at Dublin Dead Zoo. And if you go there, you can see what we've been up to with our decamp project. So lots of collections moves, things like taking down our whales. We have some videos which are quite interesting. If you've never seen anyone taking a whale apart before, you should take a look. And we've also able to answer your questions. So if you do have any questions about any of this stuff, just come onto the Twitter account and send a question to the Dead Zoo account, and I'll be happy to answer it for you.